It's really a pleasure to be here and to get to talk to you about this work I do that I love. Let me see. Yeah. So let's see. Yep, that's how we do it. Um, for the last 25 years, I have devoted myself to the question of what makes a good life, because it happens to have some personal relevance. And so that's what I'd like to talk about today. We get a lot of messages all day long from the culture about what's supposed to make a good life, what's supposed to make us happy. And if you ask young people, they'll tell you they need to get rich, they need to be famous, and they need to achieve a whole lot at work in order to be happy. But empirical research says that really doesn't work, that those aren't the tickets to happiness. So I'm here to talk about what our research has shown over 87 years. So this is a study that is the longest study of the same human beings that's ever been done. The same 724 families started in 1938. I'm the fourth director. I'm not that well preserved. It's been going a very long time. So the Harvard study of adult development actually began as two separate studies that didn't know about each other. The first, in 1938, was started at Harvard Student Health Service. The deans chose 268 young men, sophomores, who they thought were fine, upstanding specimens. And the question was, what it makes for good, healthy, normal development from adolescence to early adulthood. So, of course, if you want to study normal young adult development, you study all white men from Harvard. Like it's the most politically incorrect research sample now you could ever have. We're constantly having to convince NIH why they should still support us. Let me say at the outset, we expanded to spouses, we've expanded to children, more than half of whom are female. And so there is gender balance now in our study, but it started as Harvard College sophomores in 1938. And the other study, also started in 1938, was started at Harvard Law School. It was a study of juvenile delinquency. And the question was, why do some children born into really disadvantaged circumstances manage to stay on good developmental paths, not get into trouble, and do well? And so they chose 456 middle school age kids, boys, from not just Boston's poorest neighborhoods, but from families known to 5 social service agencies on average for domestic violence, for severe parental mental illness, physical illness. So these were kids with 3 strikes against them. And the question was, how did these kids manage to thrive? So one question is, why do this? I mean, we have been funded by NIH for more than 50 years. We've used millions of dollars in taxpayer funds. Why do that? Why spend so much time following people across their entire lives to find out about all the ups and downs of real life for thousands of people? Well, first of all, we know that most research is done by asking people to remember the past, which is a perfectly good way to collect information. But, think about it. What did you have for dinner a year ago last night, right? You have no idea unless it was a very special day. Most of what happens to us, we have to forget. There's not enough disk space to remember everything that happens to us. However, many times, and we know this from good experiments, we forget things that are of major significance in our lives. So when we ask people to remember the past, we know we're getting an incomplete picture. The other thing cognitive science has shown is that when we recall a memory, we actually change it. So, in fact, we are making stuff up without realizing it. And this, of course, is a source of great anxiety for people who rely on eyewitness testimony in courts of law. All of that is to say that following people forward in their lives has tremendous advantage in terms of understanding human life. The other thing is that often what we do when we try to follow the course of a human activity or a disease is we take snapshots. So let's say you want to study depression across the human lifespan. You could take a sample of 10-year-olds and 20-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 60-year-olds at this point in time, and you could study them and say, okay, now we know how depression progresses across the human lifespan. But what we've found too is that that can cause us to make some very faulty assumptions. I'll give you the best example is from a senator from the state of Florida. Some of you will remember the name Claude Pepper. And he once quipped, "When I look at South Florida, I would have to assume that you are born Cuban and you die Jewish." He was doing the snapshot approach. He was and making very false conclusions. So all of this is to excuse why many of us have spent decades of our lives following these families, and the unique advantage of doing that for understanding human life. So when the study began, we did physical exams. We took elaborate medical histories. We did psychological exams, psychological testing. And then research workers in the early 1940s went to the homes of these young men and talked to their parents, talked to the grandparents, and there are wonderful notes in our files about like what was being served for dinner and what the discipline style of the home was, and even what the furniture looked like. And then these people grew into adulthood. The Harvard men were of an age to go to World War II. Almost all served in the Second World War. The inner city men were on average 9 years younger, so they were not eligible for World War II. But then everybody grew up and became doctors, lawyers, laborers. John F. Kennedy was part of the Harvard group. Ben Bradley, longtime editor of the Washington Post, was part of the Harvard group. We recently learned that the Boston Strangler was part of the inner city group. But most of these people weren't famous, they weren't infamous, they were just living their lives. And we were following them year after year, asking them about their lives and studying them. And then eventually, we studied aging and retirement. Almost all of the first generation have died. Only about 10 out of 724 original men are still alive. We're still in touch with them. They're all over age 100. But their children are baby boomers, and we're very much in touch with them, still collecting data. So what have we studied? Well, we certainly send them questionnaires every 2 years. We get their medical records from their doctors. We eventually began to use new methods to study the same big domains of life. So we're studying mental health, physical health, work life, relationships. And what we do is, as new methods come online to study well-being, we use those methods. So we started putting people into the MRI scanner, something that wasn't imagined in 1938. We draw blood for DNA and messenger RNA. Again, something that wasn't conceived of in 1938. So we use new methods to study these same issues of well-being. And what did we find? Well, we've published well over 200 papers. We're on our 12th book. But the findings boil down to two essential things, one of which won't surprise you. And that is that if we take care of our health, if we take care of our bodies, makes a huge difference for our longevity, adds years of disability-free living to our lives. But the finding that we at first didn't believe was that the people who were the happiest, the healthiest, and lived the longest were the people who were the most connected to other people and the people who had the warmest relationships with other people. So when we wanted to see, okay, what are the predictors from middle age of who's going to age well, who's going to stay alive, first of all, once our people reached 80, we looked back at what we knew about them at age 50, and we thought, well, we're going to find that cholesterol is really important, blood pressure is really important, and they were, but by far the most important predictor of who was going to be happy and healthy and alive at age 80 was whether you were contented in your relationships at age 50. We didn't believe it because, we know the mind and the body are connected, but how could that be a thing? How could relationships actually get into our bodies and alter our physiology? But then many other research groups began to find the same thing. And that's important because, particularly in the research that I do, no single study is going to prove anything. You want multiple studies to point in the same direction. And now it's a very robust finding, the power of relationships, not just to keep us happy, but to keep us physically healthy. So how does this work? Well, first of all, we know that loneliness, the opposite of good social connections. Loneliness is as negative a predictor of health as we age as cigarette smoking. It's been equated to smoking about half a pack of cigarettes for decades. It's the equivalent of having untreated high blood pressure and of being obese. We also know that people with partners live longer. Men live 7 to 17 years longer on average, and women live 5 to 12 years longer. Women will always tell you that marriage is a better deal for men, but we also think this has to do with the fact that women are naturally more socially connected by and large than men, and so men have more of a benefit from partnerships. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be married, but any kind of intimate partnership will suffice. And what we know now is that people who are more socially connected as they age have brains that stay sharper longer. That if we are going to experience cognitive decline, those of us who are more socially connected experience that decline later, and then the pace of decline is much slower. So social connection protects our cognition. Okay. So then the question is, how does this work? So as researchers, we want to know, well, why? Why do relationships actually predict longevity? And the best hypothesis we have, for which there's good data, has to do with stress. So we know that loneliness is a stressor, and stress is something that happens to all of us. I mean, many of you drove here in Boston rush hour traffic. That's a stressful event. Some of you will have something happen that's stressful later in the day. The body is meant to respond with the fight or flight response. Blood pressure goes up, heart rate goes up. That's fine. But the body is meant to go back to baseline equilibrium when the stressor is removed. Well, what happens if I don't have anybody to complain to about my day, right? If I don't have anyone to go home to or to call on the phone? What we think happens in loneliness and social isolation, and we know this from research, is that people stay in a kind of low level fight or flight mode where the body is slightly revved up and never comes back to baseline. And what that means is that people who are more stressed and lonely have heightened cardiovascular reactivity, they have poorer immune function, and they have chronic low levels of inflammation. And all of these things can break down our coronary arteries, our joints, make us more susceptible to type 2 diabetes. So one of the things that's fun about doing longitudinal research is you get to ask the same questions again and again, which can be very annoying for our participants, but we ask the same 6 questions about marriage 8 times over 50 years about how satisfied they were with various parts of their marriage. And one of the things you'll see here, this is averaging, many hundreds of couples, is that we're most satisfied in our intimate partnerships when we first get together. That's no surprise. Then satisfaction goes down when the first child is born, if we decide to have children. And satisfaction only goes back up again when the last child leaves home. And, and then marital satisfaction goes back down only if kids come back to live at home. Now, this is a schematic. Your results may differ, as they say in the prospectuses. But the other thing we know is that these relationships that I'm talking about do not have to be smooth all the time. At one point, we brought couples into our laboratory and we had them have an argument with each other. And we brought them in and we said, would you list the things that you normally fight about? And then would you choose one and argue with each other for 10 minutes? And we're going to videotape you doing it. And we thought, well, they're going to be really shy. But as soon as they started to talk about the contentious matter, they forgot about the video cameras and they were just down the rabbit hole. We videotaped them. We had research assistants come in and rate the emotions that they expressed during their argument. And we thought that the level of anger in the couple would predict which couples were going to be together 5 years later when we followed them up, and which couples were going to be satisfied. We thought that the more angry couples were going to break up, or they were going to be more dissatisfied. It turns out that wasn't the case. That the best predictor during an argument of who was going to stay together and be happy was whether our raters could see affection and respect even while the couple was having an argument. And that seems really important, that it wasn't about anger. Anger and conflict are inevitable in even very good relationships. And that's worth knowing. All right. Now, as I've talked about the importance of relationships, many of you have read about the loneliness epidemic that a Pew Research survey showed recently that 1 in 3 Americans will tell you when they're stopped on the street, they'll tell you they were lonely most of the day before. And so this is quite widespread. The other thing we find is that the loneliest age groups are adults under age 30 and people in low-income households. The adults under age 30 are a surprise to many of us. I think most of us think about old age as a time of loneliness, and it can be a time of loneliness and isolation, but it is less lonely for people on average than young adulthood. That the stresses on young adults are enormous these days. And these are even young adults who are surrounded by peers, for example, in colleges. All right, so how do we lean into relationships? Because talking about all the ways in which we are more disconnected than ever, the question is, what do we do about it? And for this, I'm going to turn to one of my first Zen teachers, John Tarrant, who said this, which I love. Attention is the most basic form of love. That if you think about it, giving each other our undivided attention is the most valuable thing we've got to give, right? It's also one of the hardest things to do. I mean, I think about my wife and I in the morning, we come down to the kitchen, She's looking at her email. I'm on my phone scrolling through the news. We're not looking at each other. We're not we're not talking to each other. We've had to consciously change that. Um, and so if you think about it in your own life, in your own day-to-day routines, how often are you giving other people your undivided attention? So what can we do about this? Well, certainly, we can structure our lives differently. We can have date nights, for example. My wife and I actually, someone told us once when we had kids to have a date night, and we did. We hired a babysitter who arrived at 6 p.m. on Thursdays. And whether we wanted to or not, we were going out. And sometimes we would just go to the mall and walk around. But it was so important to have time with each other in a relationship that otherwise just felt like a tag team raising children. Um, Structuring lives at work. One of the things we know is that people who have a friend at work are more productive. They're more likely to stay on a job rather than leave for another opportunity. We also know that at work, half of CEOs are lonely. So social disconnection at work is affects the bottom line, and it's something that is preventable if workplace culture is changed. Usually that has to come from the top. Family dinners. At Mass General, we have the Family Dinner Project, headed up by my colleague Annie Fischel. What we know is that families who eat together regularly have much more family cohesion. Child development is so much stronger. Children do better in school. Children get into less trouble. There are all kinds of social skills, as we know, that get imparted during family meals. So eating together regularly can be made a priority. And finally, being in community activities, volunteering, doing the kinds of things you're all doing here this morning. This is a good thing you're doing for your health. All right. So, one of the things we know in mental health care is that relationships are both a source of strength and prevention of mental illness, but also a driver of crises. It's estimated that 1 in 5 suicides is precipitated by a crisis in a key relationship. It's also estimated that between 30 and 50% of visits to psychiatrists are primarily based on trouble in an important relationship. So this leads to what I do in my Mass General life outside of research, which is that I run a teaching program to teach young psychiatrists to talk and listen, not just to reach for their prescription pads, which is, of course, very powerful and very important, but also to listen to what's really troubling someone. So, what we know is that psychotherapy transforms lives. In psychotherapy research, the beneficial effect sizes of psychotherapy are as big or bigger than medication when it comes to most of our mental disorders. And so, what psychotherapy does is it helps people in training learn to listen to what someone says, what they don't say, to listen between the lines, as it were. Um, and psychotherapy, as we know, can help people get out of terrible, stuck places in relationships, can help couples, for example. Um, uh, Learn to deal with difficulties rather than have to break up, or can help couples break up and not drag children into wars between the couple. Um, Individuals who get stuck in patterns, dysfunctional relationship patterns, people who are constantly choosing the wrong partner or getting into the constant squabbles with bosses or friends. Psychotherapy can help people see patterns that have been invisible and can help them have more freedom and flexibility to conduct their relationships differently. And so at Mass General, we have a whole program called the Program in Psychodynamics, and this is one of our dinners, that actually allows trainees to get more experience in both learning about and conducting psychotherapy so that talk therapy becomes an active part of their armamentarium when they graduate from our training programs. And the endowment for the advancement of psychotherapy supports a lot of that. And the motto of the endowment is so that tomorrow there will be someone to talk to. And that's our goal, to make sure that psychiatrists know how to listen and know how to talk about the people's deepest concerns, not just their symptoms. All right, so my take-home messages are pretty simple, that human connection is a major source, not just of happiness, but of health, that loneliness and isolation are hazardous to our health, and it is at all levels of society and in all age groups. And finally, that we really need to be proactive about building and maintaining what we like to call our social fitness, that really actively prioritizing relationships can do an enormous amount to enhance our lives at work and certainly our lives at home. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. And I look forward to questions, thoughts you have about anything I've said.